So many years ago, I was attending a conference in San Francisco. And during an afternoon break, I needed to get outside and take a walk around and get some fresh air. And I was drawn up to this church on Nob Hill, which is one of the highest points in the whole city. It was Grace Cathedral, a gigantic, beautiful Gothic style Episcopal church. And the doors were wide open, so I walked inside. Now, lots of tourists visit Grace Cathedral, but on that day, I found myself apparently all alone in that majestic space. I made my way slowly up the stone floor center aisle toward the altar with light streaming in through the stained glass. And suddenly, though, I was stopped cold by this big, booming, echoing voice. "Welcome. May I help you?" It was impossible to tell where this voice was coming from. The place was so echoey. I instinctively looked up, I spun around, and immediately thought I probably ought to check my pulse to see if I still had one, because it sounded like the stereotype of the voice of God, and I thought maybe I had passed over without realizing it, and that place looked an awful lot like a gateway to heaven. Then I collected myself and I said, "Sorry, but the door was open." And the voice came back, "That's okay. Everyone is welcome here. Is there anything you're looking for?" And by that point, I realized this conversation could go in a lot of weird directions. So I said, "Well, now that I'm here, I do have some questions about the meaning of life." And the voice laughed and said, "Me too, but that's way above my pay grade. I'm just the organist." And then I saw him way up in the distance toward the front waving at me. So it wasn't God speaking to me after all, just an organist who had the same kind of questions I did. I'm in the business of wondering about the meaning of life and observing all that's going on in our society and wondering what to make of it and what to do about it. And in the midst of that, also attempting to listen to God. But I have never heard anything like a big, booming, echoing voice offering me any instructions. And if I had, I wouldn't admit it. But this past year, and in the past couple months, and especially in the past couple weeks, I don't think I am alone in wondering how to get some clear direction in this confusing and disorienting and even frightening time. A time that's mixed with hope and anxiety. Among other things, lately I've been reading and thinking a lot about what our post-pandemic lives might look like. And we've all felt frustrated and exhausted during the past 10 months. Many of us have felt lost and off balance. COVID just shut down so much of what we once called normal. Even if you've been able to continue working and you've figured out ways to navigate, because really what other choice have we had? Everything we've been through since last March has changed us, and it doesn't look like we're in for any quick fix. COVID exacerbated problems we already knew were there, like systemic racism and income inequality and ugly political divisiveness. It brought those problems to the surface in a way that's made us feel like we've been repeatedly just slapped in the face every day. We've had to acknowledge that those ugly things have long been part of our normal way of being, even if we've downplayed them or we've tried to ignore them. It's like we've been walking down an alley at night, whistling in the dark, but now it feels like we've actually been mugged many times. So if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we certainly don't want to, and we really can't, go back to treating those issues as if they're normal, or as if they're someone else's responsibility, or as if they'll just go away on their own. At this point, even with the vaccines rolling out, we don't have a clear timeline for when we'll be able to resume so many of the ways of being that we once took for granted. Rates of infection continue to rise, and new, more contagious variants of the virus are now on the scene. The start of the pandemic, well, it might have felt rather sudden, but the conclusion will not look like a big ticker tape victory parade. It'll be more like a slow and clumsy sack race where all the contestants are blindfolded and bumping into each other. In spite of the best laid plans, it's likely to be inconsistent, confusing, frustrating, and drawn out over many months. So there won't be any single moment when we wake up one morning, breathe a sigh of relief, joyfully toss our face masks into the trash, and crowd into packed restaurants where our only concern will be hearing one another clearly over all the chatter. That's not happening. One thing we're already dealing with and will continue to work through is the fact that we are grieving. We're grieving the staggering loss of life. We're grieving and hurting from isolation and fear and anxiety. All that's taken a huge emotional toll, and that's not something that will magically melt away. We can't say to anyone, it's time to get over this and move on, especially to anyone who's lost someone they love, or who's lost their economic security, or whose sense of safety and well-being has really been threatened. The daily reality of wearing face masks and social distancing and working and meeting and going to school online, that's not going to go away, at least not for everyone. Even when we're able to gather safely again in person, a lot of those pandemic ways of being will continue. Now, on the plus side, we will have many more options for doing things virtually, and that in itself is a good thing. When our church reopens completely, for instance, this online service, it's going to continue as an option for attending worship. Every one of our meetings, in fact, or our events, will have the option of showing up in person or attending through your phone or your laptop. So that will be our new normal. And that'll actually be good. It's smart to do that. It makes everything we do much more accessible to everyone. And we really should have been doing it long before COVID, just like so many businesses and organizations and churches. But all that being said, and understanding that so many things are not going back to the way they were before, that's put me on kind of a quest of imagining what our post-pandemic lives are going to look like. We do need to reclaim pieces of normal. We need to celebrate when it's safe to give each other a hug again and drop in on our friends. And we need to be aware that a big part of normal will be that all around us, so many of our friends and neighbors will be journeying through grief and sadness, a population comprised of the walking wounded. What I wonder most about, though, is in processing the extraordinary nature of what we've been through together, and in doing our best to navigate what's to come, where are we looking and how are we listening to be guided through all that is still ahead of us? Because in so many ways, we are in uncharted territory, not just in how we're dealing with COVID, but in how we respond to all the social and political turmoil and division we're experiencing. It's as if we have had a wilderness experience, and plenty of us have felt lost. It seems like there may be a light at the end of the tunnel, and we might be able to envision some of the things ahead, but we're still facing plenty of choices, and sometimes we just don't know what those choices will be from one day to the next. It's clear to me that we need to work on how we can be more alert and more responsive to the injustice and be advocates for truth. As individuals and as a church, that's part and parcel of what we've been put here to do in the world. It's our responsibility to be engaged. We're not a social club, and we're not a monastery, and we don't gather together just to make ourselves feel better. We're a faith community with a mission to get good stuff done for the sake of other people. That's our calling collectively. And as individuals, we each have a personal calling to live in right relationships with all of our neighbors, to embody the acceptance and the truth and the love of Christ in every relationship that we have. So, where the rubber hits the road, we always have to ask two questions. How do we hear that calling? And then, how do we know what to do with it? I, for one, would truly appreciate being able to stroll into a sacred space like a big cathedral and hear a booming voice giving me some straight answers. But the voice of God It just usually doesn't work that way. It's not that dramatic. Even in a story like young Samuel's encounter with God that Beth told us about earlier, God is pretty darn subtle. That's just how God rolls, I guess. Samuel would go on to be one of the greatest of all the prophets and have conversations with God on a regular basis, according to the Bible, but that familiarity, it almost didn't happen. When Samuel first heard God's voice, he had no idea what was going on or who was speaking. He finally had to be encouraged by his friend and mentor, Eli, to pay attention and then to act on what he was hearing. Stories like that remind us that our awareness and our alertness are things that we naturally do have. After all, Samuel did hear a voice. But we may also need the nudge of someone we know and trust to help us understand what to do next. I wonder if you've ever had the experience of receiving a subtle message from outside of yourself speaking to you. I have. To slow down, to prioritize, to invest more time in the people who matter most to you. To reclaim more control over your daily schedule, to take a personal risk helping someone in need, to contact someone you care for but you haven't thought about in a while. We might call those messages intuition or our inner voice or our gut instinct, or we say the universe is sending us a signal, whatever. I think we can also add that maybe we're actually hearing the voice of God. There's a part of us, I believe, that knows what to do in practically any circumstance, the right thing to do, the gracious thing to do, what we should focus on in that moment. And we all have a doorway into accessing that. For instance, we've all had the weird experience of thinking about someone, or we have a dream about them, or we feel concerned about them. All of a sudden, for some reason, they're on our mind, and we're not quite sure why. We might not have thought of that person in a long, long time, and then the phone rings, and it's them. And you say, "This is so crazy. I was just thinking about you." That experience is so universal that it's been studied, but no one actually still understands how it works. I think the real question is, why do we think that phenomenon is crazy at all? Just because we might not understand the mechanics of it. And why don't we sit up and take notice and take action when that person first pops into our consciousness? Well, usually because we're distracted, we're busy. Maybe that person came to mind due to a random association. We think, I saw a banana, and I know Jane loves bananas, so that's why I must have thought of Jane. But that still wouldn't explain why Jane calls me 10 minutes later out of the blue. However that works, I would never pretend to know how. Our experience is that we absolutely have a spiritual connection with other people. We've been gifted with these ears to hear messages that we call intuition or gut instinct or the universe or God. From some place that feels beyond ourselves but that pops into our mental inbox. It comes from the same place that tells us what to do in practically any circumstance, the right thing to do, the gracious thing to do, the most loving thing to do. I believe the more we learn to pay attention to those messages, to that voice calling our name, the closer we come to appreciating how connected we are to God and how interconnected we are with each other. But like young Samuel, we also need other people to guide us, to help us interpret what it is we're hearing. A trusted friend like that can be a reality check, but they can also nudge us to keep on listening and figure out how to respond. You know, in the very early Christian church, there were those who were understood as having a gift for that, for listening and guiding. They helped interpret what the Spirit of God was saying to someone. Now, we don't always think of each other in that way these days, but we ought to. Among each other, we should take advantage of all the deep, loving relationships we have to seek guidance and support and encouragement, to affirm our spiritual connection with each other, and to nudge each other in the direction of deeply listening for the voice of God. Especially as we continue to process and to navigate what our lives are going to look like in the months to come, we will have many choices to make. No doubt, there will continue to be events that shake our sense of safety and cause our hearts to sink. But we should never despair, because there's no doubt that God is right here with us through anything and everything, and in ways we don't always understand or hear clearly. God is speaking to us, calling our name, and calling us to be people who embody the presence of Christ in the world, in our community, and in our relationships. Let's be thankful that we have each other to give us a nudge now and then, to help us listen, to move us to act, and to walk beside us as we travel this uncharted territory together.